A 3-year-old girl vanishes from her own front yard in broad daylight, and 3 days later she is pulled alive from the bottom of a 10-foot pit beneath an abandoned outhouse, her tiny voice echoing off the walls of a hole no child should ever know exists. When rescuers finally reach her, she doesn't cry for help. She doesn't even understand she needs rescuing. She simply looks up and says this is where she lives now. What happened to her in those 3 days would leave her body scarred for life, but would also plant something in her that no predator could ever take away: the will to fight back, to remember, and one day, to help put her attacker behind bars using nothing but the memory of a toddler. This is the story of Lori Poland, the girl who survived the unimaginable, and then turned around and helped take down the man who tried to erase her. In the early 1980s, the town of Sheridan, Colorado, was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and children played outside without a second thought. Neighbors knew each other by name, watched each other's kids from their porches, and believed, as most small communities do, that nothing truly terrible could happen there. On an ordinary summer afternoon in August of 1983, that sense of safety was shattered in less than 60 seconds. Lori Poland, just 3 years old, was playing in her family's front yard with her older brother while their father worked nearby, painting the side of their house. It was hot, the kind of afternoon that makes a small child think only of popsicles and shade. Lori asked for something cold to eat, and her father agreed. He could still see his children through the window as he stepped inside, just a few feet away, just long enough to reach into the freezer. When he turned back around, his daughter was gone. Her brother stood alone on the lawn, and on the curb beside him lay a small pair of pants, discarded like they didn't matter. In the space of a single freezer door swing, Lori Poland had disappeared without a scream, without a struggle loud enough for anyone to notice, without a single clear trace beyond that small piece of clothing left behind. Her father ran outside, calling her name, his voice rising with a panic that any parent can imagine but few ever have to live. A neighbor mentioned seeing a car pull up to the curb only moments before and speed away just as quickly. That was it. That was all anyone had. A car, a sound of tires, and a missing little girl. Within minutes, the family called the police, and what followed was one of the most urgent manhunts the area had seen in years. Officers went door to door throughout the neighborhood, and soon federal investigators joined the search as well, treating the case with the gravity it demanded. Lori's parents, Richard and Diane, did the only other thing they could think to do. They went in front of television cameras and begged. They pleaded with whoever had taken their daughter to bring her home unharmed. Diane's voice cracked as she told the cameras that she just wanted her baby back, that she loved her, that whoever had her should know she was loved and wanted home. It's a kind of plea that no parent should ever have to make, and it aired across local news that same day, turning a private nightmare into a community-wide search. The public response was immediate. Tips began pouring in, and one witness in particular gave investigators something concrete: a partial description of the vehicle involved, along with details about its make and color. On that same first day, another resident came forward with information that, in hindsight, would prove chilling. He explained that his own children had encountered a strange man just about a week before Lori vanished. A man who had approached them in a way that felt wrong even before anyone knew a kidnapping was coming. Piece by piece, a picture was forming, but a description and a partial memory from frightened children were not enough to say where Lori actually was, or whether she was even still alive. As investigators worked the case, they began speaking with as many neighbors and witnesses as they could reach, methodically building out details about the vehicle and the man behind the wheel. Multiple children, it turned out, had encounters with the same person in the days leading up to Lori's disappearance, each report adding another layer to a portrait of someone who had been circling this community, watching and waiting, long before he ever pulled up to that curb. The realization was as terrifying as it was clarifying. This was not a crime of opportunity committed by a stranger passing through. This was someone who had been planning, someone who might strike again if he wasn't caught fast. By piecing together partial plate information and the vehicle description, investigators eventually got the break they needed. An observer resident in a nearby town recalled seeing a matching car, and that lead allowed police to trace the vehicle back to its registered owner, a local man employed as a groundskeeper, with no prior criminal record on file. On paper, he looked unremarkable, the kind of person no one would suspect. But when detectives began matching his car and his description to the reports from multiple children in the area, a disturbing pattern emerged. In several separate encounters, he had approached young children with candy, using it to lower their guard before making requests no child should ever face. Despite this pattern, there wasn't yet enough hard evidence to make an arrest. He could be questioned, watched, and suspected, but not yet charged, and every hour that passed without Laurie being found chipped away at everyone's hope. Investigators searched his home and his workplace. They spoke with his mother, his fiancée, and anyone else who might know where he'd gone or what he might have done. And still nothing. No sign of Laurie. No confession. No definitive evidence tying him to her disappearance beyond the pattern of behavior and the matching vehicle. Meanwhile, the Colorado foothills surrounding Sheridan stretched out for miles in every direction, dense with forest and crisscrossed by old trails, more than enough space to make a small child vanish, without a trace if that was what someone intended. Every day that passed made the odds worse. Statistically, most abducted children who don't come home within the first hours are never found alive, and by day 3, that grim reality was hanging over everyone involved in the search. Then, quite by accident, everything changed. Miles from where Laurie had last been seen, a couple was out enjoying an afternoon in the Colorado foothills, birdwatching along one of the many trails that wind through that stretch of mountains. They had stopped near an old, rarely used trailhead, so one of them could use the restroom, an abandoned outhouse that had clearly seen better days. As she approached the structure, she heard something that stopped her cold. A small, weak voice, crying from somewhere below. She thought at first she must be imagining it, that surely no one could be inside an old latrine pit in the middle of the wilderness. But the crying continued, and when she looked down into the darkness, she saw a pair of eyes looking back up at her. It's almost impossible to describe the horror and disbelief that couple must have felt in that moment. They called out, and the small voice inside answered, asking for her mother, asking for something as simple and heartbreaking as a drink of Kool-Aid. Emergency responders were called immediately, and a local volunteer firefighter arrived to attempt the rescue. He climbed down into the pit himself to reach her, and what he found broke his heart. A tiny girl, barely conscious, who had somehow survived days trapped in complete darkness, surrounded by filth and freezing water, with no food and no clean water to drink. Her legs, which had been injured in the fall and left untreated for days in that environment, were in devastating condition. Despite it all, she was alive, and she was breathing, and that alone felt like a miracle to everyone standing above that hole. When rescuers finally lifted her out and asked the question that seemed obvious to everyone but her, "What are you doing down there?" Laurie's answer revealed just how deeply her mind had already begun to protect itself from truth. She told them, quite simply, that she lived there. 3 days trapped in that pit had rewritten her sense of reality so completely that the horror had become her new normal. She was rushed to the hospital immediately, and her mother followed close behind, finally able to hold the daughter she had been begging strangers to return just days before. The reunion was overwhelming, filled with relief but also with fear, because Laurie's ordeal was far from over. In the hospital, her mental state fluctuated wildly. She experienced what doctors would later describe as a dissociative state, drifting in and out of a kind of protective fog that kept the worst of her memories at bay. She struggled to sleep, plagued by nightmares even in her waking hours, and she was terrified not just of strangers, but at times even of her own parents, the people who loved her most in the world. Trauma at that age doesn't always look like tears and clinginess. Sometimes it looks like flinching away from the very people trying to help. Physically, things were just as dire. The infection in her legs, caused by prolonged exposure to the contaminated water and waste in that pit, had spread aggressively. Doctors began seriously discussing amputation as the only way to save her life, a devastating possibility for a girl who hadn't even started kindergarten yet. And while her body fought that infection, investigators faced their own race against time. They believed they had identified the man responsible, but without Laurie's testimony, without more concrete evidence, he remained free, and free meant dangerous. Every day he walked around uncharged was another day he might target another child. This is where Lori's story takes an extraordinary turn, one that still amazes the professionals who worked her case decades later. Her pediatrician at the time, a doctor who specialized in working with traumatized children, began gently working with her to help her process and recall what had happened. Conventional wisdom said it would be nearly impossible. 3-year-olds don't form reliable long-term memories the way adults do, and trauma often causes the mind to bury the very details investigators most need. And yet, over the course of about 2 weeks, working patiently and carefully with someone trained to speak to children who have been through the worst, Lori began to talk. She described a man pulling up to her house quickly, offering her candy, the kind of thing that would seem harmless and even exciting to a 3-year-old who had no reason yet to distrust strangers. She described being taken, being harmed in ways she was too young to fully understand, but old enough to remember as deeply wrong. And then she described what happened after, being carried into the woods to an old, isolated structure and dropped down into total darkness. She talked about landing hard, about pain in her foot, about the cold and the smell and the fear of the unknown water below her. Alone in that pit, with nothing to rely on but instinct, she had managed to find a small mound of debris rising above the water and had pulled herself onto it, keeping as much of her body as she could away from the filth beneath her, even as her legs, dangling off the edge, paid the price. She talked about the passage of time becoming meaningless in that darkness, unable to tell whether it was day or night, hours or what felt like an eternity blurring together as hunger, thirst, and pain wore her down. She talked about flashes of memory, brief and fleeting images of her mother's face that would surface and then slip away just as quickly, as if her own mind were trying to protect her by keeping the good memories just out of reach of the bad ones. By the time rescuers found her, she was fading fast, and doctors would later say that had she been left even a short time longer, the outcome likely would have been fatal. In a strange twist of fate, the very environment that had nearly killed her, the cold, damp isolation of that pit, may have actually helped keep her alive by protecting her from the harsher, colder exposure she would have faced if left out in the open mountain air overnight. What Lori gave investigators, piece by piece, in that small examination room, became the backbone of the case against her attacker. It confirmed what they had already suspected from witness patterns, that this had not been a spontaneous act, but a calculated one, carried out by someone who knew exactly where he was going and what he intended to do once he got there. Faced with mounting evidence, including Lori's own account, the man was eventually taken into custody. And in perhaps one of the most remarkable moments of the entire case, investigators asked 3-year-old Lori to try to identify her attacker from a police lineup. Despite everything she had been through, despite being barely old enough to complete a sentence reliably, she did it. Witnesses in the room described her reaction as immediate and unmistakable, her small body physically recoiling the moment she recognized him, a silent but undeniable confirmation that needed no words at all. The path to justice, however, was far from straightforward. As the case moved toward trial, the man's wife provided an alibi on his behalf, complicating the prosecution's case and raising the very real possibility that a jury might not convict him at all, especially given how young and how vulnerable their primary witness was. Faced with this uncertainty, prosecutors ultimately agreed to a plea deal, one that dropped the most serious charges in exchange for a guaranteed conviction. It was a decision made to ensure some measure of accountability rather than risk an outright acquittal, but it meant a devastating reduction in potential prison time. A sentence that could have stretched for decades was reduced to a fraction of that, and in the end he served only a portion of even that shortened term before being released for good behavior. For Lori, though, the story didn't end with a courtroom verdict. It was only the beginning of a much longer journey. As she grew older, the psychological weight of what she had survived followed her, manifesting in depression, anxiety, and symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress. She struggled with trust, with self-worth, with the ordinary challenges of childhood and adolescence made immeasurably harder by what she carried with her. But with consistent therapy and support from the people around her, Lori slowly began to reclaim pieces of her life that trauma had tried to take. 2 decades after nearly dying at the bottom of that pit, Lori achieved something her family had never seen before. She became the first person in her extended family to graduate from college. It was a milestone that meant far more than a diploma. It was proof, to herself as much as anyone, that her past did not have to dictate her future. From there, rather than retreating from the world that had hurt her so badly as a child, Lori chose to walk directly toward it, dedicating herself to counseling other children who had survived abuse of their own. She understood, in a way few others could, exactly what those children needed to hear, that survival was possible, and that their history did not have to define who they became. Today, Lori Poland is a mother herself, and she has built a career around turning her worst experience into a source of healing for others. She works alongside the very doctor who first helped her recover her memories all those years ago, and together they co-founded an organization dedicated to ending child abuse and neglect. Through her work, she has come to understand something that many people find difficult to accept, that cycles of abuse often repeat themselves, and that the man who hurt her had, according to what she has since learned, endured abuse of his own, starting at nearly the same age she was when he took her. This understanding hasn't changed what he did to her, and it hasn't erased what it cost her, but it has shaped the way she chooses to move forward. Rather than being consumed by anger, Lori has spent years working directly with individuals who have caused harm, sitting in rooms with people who have committed serious offenses and listening to their own histories, not to excuse what they've done, but to understand the roots of it, in hopes of breaking the cycle before it claims another child. It's an approach rooted not in forgetting, but in transformation, using her own survival as a tool to prevent someone else's tragedy. Lori Poland's story is, at its core, about the astonishing resilience the human mind is capable of, especially in a child too young to even fully grasp the danger she was in. A 3-year-old who could barely speak in full sentences became the key witness in her own case, using fragments of memory to help ensure her attacker faced consequences. She is living proof that survival is not the end of a story, but often just the difficult, uneven beginning of a much longer one. Her scars, both physical and emotional, remain part of who she is, but they have never defined the entirety of her life. Instead, she has spent her adulthood turning what was meant to destroy her into something that protects others, proving that even the darkest beginnings can lead to a life built on purpose, healing, and hope.